My name is Caroline O'Donoghue. I'm the author of The Rachel Incident, or El Factor Raquel. Raquel? We're just saying Rachel. The Rachel Incident is a book about a woman called Rachel, who we meet in the first chapters as a woman in her 30s. She's pregnant, she's a journalist, she's living in London, but she's at a Christmas party and she runs into somebody from her past. And this run-in brings her back in time to her life in Ireland when she was in her 20s with her best friend James Devlin. And what this whole story, this whole incident focuses on is a piece of gossip that was spread about her and her English professor that is not actually true, but she has almost lived her life as though it were. It's funny with Rachel and talking about love and relationships because on the one hand, she has extremely high standards, and on the other, she has no standards at all. So she's obsessed with her kind of boyfriend, on again, off again boyfriend, Kerry, and she just thinks he's the most magnificent human being who's ever existed, and she wants to hear from him every minute of every day, and she wants to know what he's doing all the time, and she wants all these things from him, and she wants everything to look a certain way, but all at the same time, he could kind of do anything and she would still love him. And I loved exploring Rachel's relationship to love because I do think she's of that age where, maybe she's watched too much Sex and the City and she thinks that we have to keep our true selves from the men that we love and then and just show them a kind of a perfect shop front, and we keep our real selves for our friends. And maybe that works to a certain point, but what happens with Rachel is that she keeps her true self for James and her kind of fake self for her boyfriend, and he's not an idiot. He can see that she's being fake and he doesn't really want to be around it. And it's only not until much later that Rachel kind of really realizes that, and I think it takes a lot of women a long time to realize that. I think Rachel's obsession with Kerry has such a lot to do with the first time you have good sex with someone. And I think people don't really talk about this that much of there's often a gap of a few years between when you first have sex for the first time and when you first meet somebody who's incredibly sexually compatible with you. And I think she finds that with him, and not only does she find somebody who's really compatible with her and who's very exciting to her, but he also just adores her. He thinks that she looks like Wonder Woman. He thinks that she's got the greatest mind of a generation. He compares her to Noam Chomsky at a certain point, and he just thinks she's fabulous, that just as she is. And of course she would fight tooth and nail to keep a guy like that. But I think the tragedy of it is that she doesn't understand that he's really being serious when he means that he likes her for who she is, and she still just sort of puts up this veneer, I suppose. God, the cultural moment of that time, I don't know if this has reached Spain yet, but I think it's been summed up by the phrase indie sleaze. Do you have that? Indie sleaze kind of refers to that moment in the late 2000s, early 2010s, where everybody would go to the club in a blazer or wear ballet flats all the time, and there was an enormous amount of guitar music happening, and there was a lot of gigs happening. I think a lot about what was happening musically during that time period, because what it was really was that CD sales were crashing because downloading and streaming was taking over. And so what happened to fill that gap was that bands started touring more and more. And so there were all these bands who, for example, I remember so much about that time period, Kate Moss and Pete Doherty, but then the bands that Pete Doherty was in would be touring in your town, and that would be so crazy. And you felt like you could sort of touch this culture that felt so vibrant and alive and grungy and sexy and dangerous and real, but it was also in your town next Saturday. And it was a really special moment. I'm not sure if that's what other music scenes were like, but that's certainly, when other people were young, but that's certainly what it felt like when I was young. No, I think any of my friends would tell you that I am the most unnostalgic person out of my entire group of friends. I throw away all my birthday cards. I don't have any photos of my own wedding in my house. I'm I remember what it was like. It was fine. I'm not one of these people who really treasures moments. I'm always sort of moving forward all the time. But I do think the moments where I look back on things, and definitely what Rachel is doing in the book, is that she is looking back on this period of her life where she did a lot of questionable things, like morally, ethically, whatever, and looking in part at like the context of what made her do those things. So like the context of Ireland during the time where she grew up, and like, yes, it's easy to look back on the stupid things you did when you were 22 and blame yourself, but it's much healthier, I think, to zoom out and look at everything else that was going on, and the pop culture landscape, the political landscape. And I do think if you're gonna spend a lot of time looking back with a wider lens tends to be the healthiest way to do it, I think. Yeah, what I love about the Rachel incident is that because it happens over a really long period of time, we're constantly flashing back between Rachel and James when they were in the early 2000s and Rachel and James now, and they're still best friends. Rachel lives in London and James lives in New York, but they're still on the phone to each other all the time, they visit each other all the time, and I think maybe what keeps them together is, and I think also what the book is about, actually, because Rachel says this on the page at a certain point where she says, the year that she spent living with James, it taught her the value of context and the value of people. And she says it doesn't matter who's closeted or who's lying or who's weak or who's this or who's poor or who's rich. It's sort of everyone is responding to, what's going on around them and the person that they were raised to be. And like, if you can learn to be sympathetic to that, then you can learn to be sympathetic to anyone. And that's a really good way to keep friends for the rest of your life. So Rachel and James what's very interesting about them is that when they come together, they're both these, 22-year-olds who are working in a bookshop and they're worried about their future. And it seems, to Rachel at least, like their worlds are the same. But as we go on, we realize that there's a difference between, I'm not sure if you have a Spanish translation for this, but a difference between being broke and being poor. And Rachel is broke, which means she comes from a good background. She has the tools and the resources to maybe one day get a really good job, but at the moment she has no money. James is poor. He comes from a background where probably nobody in his family has done third level education. He probably hasn't finished all of school himself. He doesn't have these same advantages. And I think a lot about these two characters is like reconciling the gaps between them as well as the similarities. So Rachel and James meet when they're working at a bookshop together around the Christmas period in, I think, 2009. And you're right, and so they do kind of bond over their mutual crush on this man. But I think really what draws them together is they're both kind of hiding. James is hiding because, he's gay and he feels like he has to wait until he's left Ireland in order to have the full expression of his sexuality. And Rachel is kind of hiding in a different way. I think she was this girl who was sort of, good in school and always had her homework done on time for her whole life. And I think there's this part of her that's sort of wild and unmanageable that James sort of brings out, and that she felt like she couldn't express with either her old friends or her family. And it's really through discovering their true selves that they discover one another. No, youth is not the best moment for friendship. I think that, everyone can name lots of people who they were friends with when they were 21, 22, who they thought were just like their soulmates, who they either drifted away or they turned out to be way less impressive than you thought they were. But I do think your early 20s is a time where you're going through so much growth, you're so chaotic, you're so messy. So if you do meet somebody who can hold you through all those moments where you're messy and unpredictable and not always the best version of yourself, and they decide to love you anyway, that's pretty amazing. However, I do think your 30s are every bit as good as for friendship, just in different ways. So the book takes place after the economic crash in Ireland after 2008. And now obviously the economic crash happened everywhere, but it really felt like it happened in Ireland. And I think why that is because Ireland for a long time there was kind of no class system whatsoever. It was like people either had money or they hadn't. And then in the kind of 90s there was this explosion of wealth that happened that created this abundant middle class of overnight. And then in 2008 that just vanished, and so you had this entire culture that was not even quite used to having money in the first place, suddenly having none again, and the entire society was sort of leveled. Now my experience of growing up in Ireland during the kind of the good times was that it was this amazing place where like everybody always had something going on, and it was so much fun, and everybody was in a band, and everybody had big dreams. And then it was like watching all those dreams crash around us overnight. And because I was so young, everybody I knew left the country. And so there was a certain point where I had more friends in Australia than I did in my hometown. And that kind of alienation and that feeling of hopelessness is really what Rachel is experiencing in the early chapters of this book. So it's interesting because Ireland we all think of as being a very modern and very progressive country, and in many ways it is, but that is quite new. So up until 2018 we didn't have the right to an abortion in Ireland. That was changed. It was called repealing the Eighth Amendment, which means that the part of the Constitution that said that women couldn't have terminations. So that's really recent, which means that I grew up in a world where, thinking about if I were to have sex with somebody and if I were to accidentally get pregnant from that sex, that the termination would make me into a criminal. And that vastly changes how you think about sex and how you think about the opposite sex. And that's something I really wanted to get into with Rachel. And as far as being gay goes, like I can't remember the exact time stamp, but gay sex acts were illegal in Ireland until the early 90s. And I think we got gay marriage in 2015. So like, we have a church and a state that until very recently were incredibly intertwined. And there are loads of other things that would really shock you about how the government and how the church colluded in Ireland to make people's lives incredibly bad. And I really feel like it's my responsibility as an artist to remind people how recent that was and how deep the scars in people's psyches still are. So it's hard to say whether or not Ireland is different now. I mean, obviously the perception of Ireland is very different. We're very fortunate that we have for a very small country, we have such a huge amount of people who are involved in the arts, who are so incredibly talented and are like boosting the profile of the country all over the world. I don't live in Ireland, and I haven't for almost 13 years. So it's impossible for me to say whether things have improved on a day-to-day point of view. But certainly I think people are incredibly progressive. Like Ireland was, very outspoken about the genocide in Palestine from very early on, before lots of countries got involved, and that's something I'm incredibly proud of as my country. But like, there's still some conservative thought, but I do think we're doing really well. Yeah, I think there's really no other way to deal with these things except for with humor. Maybe because it's a coping mechanism. Maybe because it makes it less scary, but I think ultimately it's what people do. I had a dinner the other night with two women who between them had 4 miscarriages in the last year, and they were cracking up about them, and they were talking about how they used to get time off work for their periods, and now they're getting time off work for their miscarriages. And it was so dark, but it was so funny, and they were laughing so hard, and you could really feel the release in the room that all these women felt safe to say this in this setting. And I think that like we need that. We deserve that. The world is dark, and we deserve to have a good time with our friends about it. And I really want this book to be a friend to people, I think the reason it's done well is that it's optimistic and lighthearted about things that are sometimes really dark.